logical troubleshooting technique is to shut down and start over. Just what I had to do to get the microphone working again. Okay, everybody pick up two handouts today, both of which are online, but we'll be talking about that as we go through. So today, we kind of pull everything together and we'll talk about research strategy. And what I've put together for you is a research strategy checklist, and this is on the course website under handouts, if you lose the paper or just prefer it online. And what I tried to do with this handout, and we're pretty much going to go through it soup to nuts, is to pull together much of what we've talked about. So you kind of have the entire course in 4 pages. I'm going to explain a little bit, so obviously we've spent a lot more time than 4 pages worth. But this is essentially a checklist to go through, obviously, when you're researching. And of course, you're not going to do every single thing here that's listed for any given issue, and certainly not every issue. There are going to be plenty of issues that you research that either need to be quick and dirty, or just turn out to be fairly straightforward, and you can sit down on Google or Westlaw or whatever you have available and do a fairly simple search. So I'm not trying to tell you you have to do this every time, quite the contrary. This is a checklist, so this is to go through and say, okay, to help you not forget. So you can look at that and say, oh, I don't need to do that, or this doesn't apply, or this isn't a statutory issue, or this isn't a common law issue. But hopefully this will help you remember what's available and some tips and tricks. Also, this turns out to be a fairly decent checklist for the exam. And now, again, we will talk about the exam in total depth next class, the entire class. But I wanted to point that out today, and I will certainly repeat that next class as we do talk about the exam. So to start with the capital letters on top, at any point, ask. If you have access to a librarian at work, as I've said many times, as continuing students, as graduating alums, feel free to call us anytime, and we'll do our best to get you started. This is what we do for a living. As you can hear, I spend a lot of time doing this, so definitely ask for help. I mentioned a couple of classes ago that I had gone to a meeting, I don't know, probably 3 or 4 weeks ago, with a bunch of law firm librarians. So people in the trenches working with attorneys who are representing clients. And they talked a lot, it was a meeting between academics like myself and the law firm librarians, and we talked about how we can help each other to help their new attorneys hit the ground running a little better or adapt as soon as possible. And one of the frustrations the law firm librarians mentioned is people don't ask when they need help. And I have to say, in a way, I kind of share that. Some of you may notice on your assignments, I say, ask if you're confused. Asking is a good thing. Okay, so let's dive into the substance. We talked at the beginning of the class about essentially issue spotting, analyzing your facts and formulating your questions. And in part, term generation. We talked a lot about computers being stupid, and you have to figure out the terminology. Again, I come back to our favorite example of preemption. You have to identify first that is even something you have to worry about, and you also have to know the lingo, preemption in our case. So you want to become familiar with the facts of the case. We talked a little bit about going back to your client and asking questions. Remember, our hypothetical client didn't have a pre-existing condition. Way back when we did our first exercise in the class, a few people were kind of caught by that fact that she had a pre-existing heart condition. So you want to think about what are the facts matter to you. What we did determine is that what we really want to go back and find out is what was the appeals process she went through with her HMO, and is there any kind of negligence or fiduciary claims that we can make against the HMO. So those are more facts we actually still need to get. So become familiar with your facts. Formulate your questions. Again, the preemption question. Start to think about, what do I have to worry about? What do I not have to worry about? The who, what, where, why, when exercise we went through again. You don't necessarily answer all of those questions, and sometimes different questions are significant, more significant or less. But it's a good structure just to get you started to think about how you're going to frame the issue, and also to think about terminology. Remember, we wrote across the board, we started to think about what some of the terminology is that we might want to utilize when we're doing our search. Refining your questions. Again, figuring out, is this a pre-existing condition issue? Is discovering, oh, wait a minute, there's this whole ERISA preemption thing. I have to first research that before I even get to the whole liability of the HMO. And just some basic classification, federal, state, both. In our case, it might be both. Do you have a civil, criminal? Usually straightforward, not necessarily always. Procedural, substantive. Sometimes you have to worry about procedural issues before you even get to the substance. Are there statute of limitation questions? I mean, you all sat through Civ Pro, so you know there's lots of procedural questions that you may need to worry about. And of course, where you start, whether putting finger to keyboard, what you pull up, what you start to look at first, what terminology you put in, what questions you frame, is going to be based upon what you're starting with. Do you have a case? Do you have a statute? Do you already know about preemption and have some experience with ERISA? Maybe not. So that's going to determine where you start. You might not want to start with an encyclopedia if you've been working on this issue for a fair amount of time. Okay, so that's analyzing your facts. Getting background in the issue, the good old secondary sources. We spent more time in the course, if you look at the syllabus, on secondary sources than we did in any other unit, and that was intentional. That's where you're going to get your most bang for the buck. So many attorneys, not necessarily just new ones, want to just dive in and research the cases. I think because you talk so much about cases in law school, that's just where your mind goes. It kind of makes sense. I can appreciate that. But I can't, just about any research issue that I need to work on, whether faculty asking me questions or I have somebody at the reference desk with a question I never heard before, which are the fun ones, by the way, I'm going to start in secondary source. I will not dive into the cases first thing for sure. I'll put that off as long as I can, honestly, because I want to see if I can get references first. So take advantage of someone else doing the work for you. Where to start? We talked about research guides. Finding research guides these days, probably good old-fashioned Google. Remember also, I've lost my screen here, research guides. I mean, we're talking about legal research, so we academic law librarians love making research guides. So pick your favorite law school, obviously a school in the state of the jurisdiction you're interested in. So here at Hofstra, we do have indeed research guides. You can find them on our webpage. I've also given you a quick reference under class web links. You have to remember it would come under secondary sources. And you'll see research guides. Or you could just research guides Hofstra Law School and it would come up on Google. We talked about starting in legal encyclopedias. And legal encyclopedias being the more basic, broader brush, covering A to Z in terms of topics, but doesn't go into a great deal of depth. Dictionaries. We didn't talk a whole lot about dictionaries, but even good old Black's Dictionary might get you started. Again, depending on the issue and the terminology. Words and phrases, not actually on the handout here, but another thought, especially if you have an issue that revolves around the definition of a word. ALR. In this meeting I went to with the law firm librarians, they all were like, yeah, ALR is great, but nobody uses it anymore. So be an exception to that rule. ALR is, I think, a great resource because it's one of those resources, either you find something good or you don't. Don't spend an hour looking for an ALR article. It might just not be there. But if you find something good, it's going to help you a whole lot. Remember, our ALR article turned out to sort of be the best secondary source starting point on liability of HMO. It was a little old, but it got it started, introduced us to preemption and ERISA and where we would find the statute. So don't forget about ALR. In terms of strategy for using any of these resources, and while I listed this particular hint under secondary sources, it really applies to any resource. And that is, don't forget the print indexes. Yes, online is easier. I'm not telling you always go to a print index, it's better. But a print index can help you with that terminology when you are struggling to figure out what words to type in. And a number of you noticed that as you were going through on the various assignments. Again, not just secondary sources, but in statutes as well. Even some of you made that observation that the key number system was kind of like an index, which it is, to help you with the terminology. When you can't think of the words to type in and you're just getting irrelevant results, maybe just scanning through, overall, if you look under HMO, look under what comes under in the index under HMO, or even healthcare or tort law, and you might start to get a sense of what some of the terminology is. And then go online when you've gotten some help, hopefully. And of course, Google, even Wikipedia, not a bad place to start. Again, actually, Wikipedia gets you started. As I mentioned, I use Wikipedia. I don't really read, I sort of scan through Wikipedia. I certainly don't rely on it. I never ever cite it, but I use Wikipedia. I go down to the footnotes. It'll give me a nice introduction to a topic, and then it'll give me the references, sometimes to some good secondary sources or even to the primary. Google's very hit or miss, sometimes pretty good, and who knows what you're going to get when you do a Google search. Very much dependent upon the terminology still. But we found some good websites on employment law, either the Department of Labor, just doing a very basic Google search. Again, when you're online, be very, very aware, again, our theme of bibliographic awareness, of what you're looking at. How old is it? Has it been updated in the last 10 years? There are websites that haven't. Trust me, because I put them up and I haven't updated them. And speaking of the fact that someone like me can put up a website, be very, very aware of, get a sense of who's responsible for that website. I always joke that I could put up Lisa's Bar and Grill and website, a legal website, and then muck around with the U.S. code and put in the word not where it doesn't normally appear. Now, yes, I have much better things to do with my time. But the point being, you want to be aware, not so much of people doing weird things like that. I think I'm the only one who's ever thought of that. But be aware of organizations that have a particular point of view. Any controversial issue that you can think of, there's going to be an organization with a website. And you'll run across that in your Google search. And if they're really good at search engine optimization, which we're going to talk about very little bit in a little while, their search results will come up top. So I used to do a search, and I used to get this Second Amendment advocacy group coming up on type, and they had constitutional law, but they didn't say that they were what their point of view was, that they even were interested in the Second Amendment particularly, or what their point of view on the Second Amendment was. But you would do a general constitutional law search, and you'd get what seemed like it had nice eagles and flags and all sorts of patriotic things on it. So you'd think, it looked kind of official. You want to be really careful what the source is for the website, which is why I point you to .gov sites, .edu. I mean, yes, we academics have our points of view too, for sure. But there tends to be more of a scholarly approach in academia, at least one hopes. So once you have an introduction, dive into some of the more in-depth. Again, if this is an issue that requires you to do in-depth research, again, remember treatises. That's another resource that the law firm librarians talked about. I wish these new attorneys knew more about using treatises, or knew just to use treatises. And if they find a treatise, and this I found perplexing because I don't run into this, certainly not with you guys and with much people. If you find a good treatise in one area of law, think about the fact that maybe there's a good treatise in another area of law, which I know sounds really obvious, which is why I said I haven't run into that, but that's what they've encountered, so I have to take them at their word. Law reviews. A bunch of you really like starting or moving on to law reviews because you're familiar with them, but also because they tell you what the law is and they go into detail. That's great too. For practice-oriented research, law reviews are going to be a little more limited in terms of their usefulness, because after they tell you what the law is, then they're going to tell you what the author thinks the law should be, and obviously that doesn't really help you in terms of practicing and representing that client, unless of course you're making an argument before a court. Remember with law reviews, online indexes. I just had this experience yesterday with he was a second or third year, I don't recall what year, but a law student, one of your colleagues, writing a paper, and was writing a paper on an issue that just, you couldn't, there was no term of art. And so trying to do a full text search on Lexis and Westlaw, you're getting the classic, a whole lot of irrelevant articles that had nothing to do with this issue. Go into the legal periodical index that we talked about, and again, off of the library homepage into, and other ways, if you have another way of getting this topic list, we're looking for articles, article finding, and if it ever gets there, the index to legal periodicals, and not foreign unless you're doing foreign law research. So remember that, again, as one of the tools in your toolbox as an alternative when the regular, either Google Scholar searching, another good place to look for law reviews, Google Scholar or Lexis Westlaw full text searching isn't doing the trick. We looked very recently at practice manuals and guides, not to mention loose leafs, which is further down on the list. I think those will be where you are going to head most frequently once you get a basic understanding of your issue, because those are going to give you what you need to know as a lawyer representing a client, not some theoretical point of law and how the law should be. Going to give you this checklist, the forms, the loose leafs, or formerly known as loose leafs, pull together not only all that good stuff, but the primary sources as well, all in one spot. So the statutes, the regulations, those difficult to find admin decisions if they're relevant. And we looked at a very specialized practice aid guide, American jurisprudence, proof of facts, and then causes of action. So again, provided those practice-oriented. Just remember, wherever you wind up, remember to check out your Lexis Westlaw contract, because secondary sources, especially these treatises, the loose leafs, we looked at Nimmer, we looked at a torts treatise on Westlaw, depending on what your contract is, super duper expensive on Lexis and Westlaw if it's not included. If it's included, you're good. Just find out what that contract is and what the parameters are. And again, if you have a librarian, they're going to be able to give you the ins and outs of how to do cost-effective searching. If not, figure out who in your organization does the negotiating with Lexis and Westlaw and find out what they know. They may not know very much, but I tell you, they'll be really appreciative that you're being cost aware. And a lot of times, the services will send out people to help train you, and they will give you tips on cost-effective research, even though it means they make a little less money, because they know everybody's worried about that, and they know if you can't do cost-effective research, you're going to switch over to the other guys. One other tip that's actually not on here that I should have mentioned many more times than I have, and I hope this isn't the first time, but if it is, here it is. Lexis and Westlaw and Bloomberg have 24/7 customer support. Take advantage. You can have these people help you formulate searches. They obviously won't do the research for you. They certainly won't interpret what you get. But they're actually pretty good at search formulation. They're good at, if you forget exactly where to go on Lexis for legislative history, or any other example, administrative decisions, whatever it is that you need. Again, they're 24/7. They have the online chat, which I think is close to 24/7, except for maybe like 2 a.m. on Saturday, something like that. But utilize it. I've spoken to a number of new attorneys who found that to be the greatest lifeline, and it's free. And a lot of times what they'll do is they'll do the search for you online, but they won't be charging you anything. So they might, depending again on your contract and how that's structured, they might help you out from a cost standpoint as well. So on page 2 at the top, we're still talking about secondary sources. What we talked about, why why you want, what the advantages are. I'm not going to go into any more detail since we've talked a lot about that, other than to say, again, with secondary sources on Lexis Westlaw, check the iLink to see what the currency is. Again, some of those treatises may not have been updated for 4 years, which they still may be useful because they explain things, but then you know that they haven't been updated for 4 years, and you might need to look into whether there have been any changes to statutes, to cases, to the primary sources. Other tips for using secondary sources, and again, this applies not just to secondary sources. Remember the table of contents. Whenever I have a research project, the first thing I do is go to secondary source. When I'm in that secondary source, if it is organized by subject, I will inevitably look at the table of contents. I'll do my keyword search. Maybe I'll get a great section. Looking at the table of contents, maybe there's another great section. Or maybe there's a totally different section that I didn't realize was relevant, but looking at the table of contents, I realized, oh, I better read that. And when you're online in a secondary source, you can choose. The nice thing is, what you can't do in print is you can search just a particular chapter. So you may be in a very general secondary source on torts. For our client, we're not interested in the entire law of torts, but maybe we're interested in the chapter on HMOs. And we can do a keyword search on the systems by choosing that particular chapter or section. As you go through, especially with secondary sources, but as you go throughout your process, have somewhere in the middle of your mind, is this working? Again, don't spend an hour thinking I have to find something in ALR or I have to find a treatise. There may not be something out there that works for you. Are you sure that you've classified your problem correctly? We talked in the beginning, so none of you made this mistake who did the T question. But in the past, I've had students think that T question was a product's liability question. Of course, a product hasn't been made yet, so it's not really. But did people make mistakes? That's what part of being human. So think about whether you've classified the problem. Think about whether they're shedding any light. When we did our research for our liability HMO, Amjur just wasn't useful. Full stop. So we don't use Amjur. So it's not helping. It's not shedding any light. You're going to be constantly asking and revising your questions, as we already talked about. So as you go through and realize, oh, wait a minute, I need to think about negligence. Is the person who made the decision at the HMO, can I show, any way I can show that they've been negligent, because maybe that's a way to get out of ERISA preemption if that's what I want to do. We talked about fiduciary. A lot of times, most of the time, you will need to revise your questions, because if you already knew the answer, you wouldn't be doing the research, right? Not always. Again, there are going to be some basic questions, or you're going to be some just basic issues that don't require all of this effort. Try to keep a log. Difficult to do because you really are involved in getting the research done, so you can move on to actual writing whatever you have to write, representing the client. I showed you where the history was in Lexis and Westlaw. That's one way to help you keep a log. There are any number of methods. I've heard of a two-pad method, where you have resources you checked and then the resources that you actually want to use, and that helps you, the resources that you checked pad helps you not spin your wheels, because what will happen is, I know already happens in your day-to-day existence, something's going to come up and you're going to get interrupted. And you're going to have whatever research you've done, you're going to go back to it 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, and it won't be quite as fresh in your mind. And if you're unfortunate enough to have a memory as bad as mine, you won't really remember what you did. So to the extent that you keep a log, you'll save yourself a lot of time. Okay, so that's secondary sources. Any questions? So hopefully with secondary sources, you've gotten some leads. You found out about ERISA in 29 U.S.C. 1144. Maybe you've gotten some references to cases. When we were looking at secondary sources, we did run across a few references to the Aetna case. Maybe that's relevant, maybe it isn't. We actually ran across a couple of references, I think, to the Rush Prudential case. So again, hopefully you are keeping track of that as you're going through your secondary sources. Remember to check all of them. Lots of issues aren't administrative, so you'll have no reason to check admin materials, but make sure you determine that affirmatively. Nope, this isn't administrative, don't need to worry about it. Likewise, statutory. So if it is statutory, that's probably where you want to start. Obviously, if it isn't, then you don't. But look at those references and then take advantage of your BFF, as the old term used to be, best friend forever, your annotated code. Online, in print, whatever you prefer, because that's, again, going to pull together those references, notes of decisions. Sometimes those notes of decisions will be great, sometimes they won't be so great, but it'll get you started, again, with your case research without having to go to anything else. If you do have to do legislative history research, if you have to figure out what Congress or the state legislature meant by particular language, the annotated code is where you're going to get the necessary chapter of public law information, the historical and statutory notes, so you know which public laws or chapter laws to take a look at. And you'll get other references to secondary sources. You know, we talked about we need to learn about preemption, but now that we're actually at the preemption section, that might give us some good leads as to other sources to help explain for our particular situation. And of course, and this is true for secondary sources as well, make sure to update. Online, pretty easy, not really too much to do. Just be aware of when your resource, the currentness link. When did Westlaw last update the regs? When did Lexis last update the statutes? And look for flags. Again, be bibliographically aware. Just look for the, hey, this resource has been updated. I showed you an example of a statute where one of those services, I forget which, I think it was Westlaw, just hadn't quite incorporated the update yet. So just be aware of that. Again, table of contents, enormously useful in statutes. Moving on to case research. Again, hopefully you've got references from secondary sources, perhaps the notes of decisions. All along, as you're going through all of these resources, you're learning terminology. With cases, if you can, it's going to be easier to start with the one good case that we talked about, whether it's from notes of decision, secondary source, wherever. And take advantage of that case to look at the head notes if you're in Lexis, topic and key numbers in Westlaw, say the head note in Bloomberg Law if that's what you're using, and see if they're useful. Sometimes they're not going to be. I'm not going to tell you always you have to use topics and key numbers or head notes. Sometimes they just won't fit in with your issues. On the other hand, sometimes they will be super useful. Some of you struggled with our attorney research question, whether or not an attorney could be held liable for not doing proper research. And those of you who were able to find the topic and key number, boom, there were the cases, because that was well designed for that. There was a topic and key number right on point. Those of you who hadn't found it yet were struggling with all of the terminology and had a harder time finding cases. So there's an example where it does work. There are plenty of examples where it won't work quite as well. What you want to do, and I should have mentioned this with statutory research as well, if you really need to be totally comprehensive with statutory research, with case research, and also true with admin research, you want to use more than one method. So if you got a reference, you got 291144 from one of the secondary sources, you still want to do some independent research in the statutes to make sure you're not missing something that particular secondary source didn't mention because that wasn't its focus. You want to do the same for cases. Yes, topics and key numbers are great. I'm extolling the virtues. Also do, again, if the issue is important enough, also do a keyword search, because as great as the topic and key number search, keyword search, for whatever reason, might pull up cases, issues that you hadn't encountered through the topics and key numbers or through your secondary sources. And in addition to remembering, of course, with cases, update, Shepherd's Key Site, B-Site can help you research as well. Using the head notes, if you find good head notes, just seeing what other cases cite to your case. If you've got a kind of old case, if you've got a case from 1910, you really want to find something more recent if you can to rely on. Shepard's KeyCite, BCite are going to be the best way to do that. And not the only way, because maybe there's a more recent case that doesn't cite to your case, but take advantage, again, of the tools in your toolbox. Oh, and from a usage online cost efficiency standpoint, again, depending on your contract and depending on your own time limitations, because your time is money as well, think about getting a citation list from Lexis and Westlaw using all these wonderful tools, and then going over to Google Scholar or finding the case on the free web. If resources are tight, if you're working pro bono, for instance, that is one technique to use where you take advantage of the strength that the online services provide you, but where they tend to charge is when you actually look at an actual document, at least Lexis Advance and Westlaw Next. That's sort of their standard charging mode. So nothing says that you can't look at your case results and then go to Google Scholar or whatever court website. Regulations, admin materials, pretty much all the strategies I've already mentioned. References, that loose leaf that pulls together, especially for the admin decision, very difficult to find. Again, as I mentioned, that Virginia site is a disappointment since it hasn't been updated and there are a lot of broken links. So I think probably going to the government website and then doing a search within that site, whether the government site provides you with a search tool or we use our advanced Google site : and the web address. Table of contents, because admin is as specialized in terms of the vocabulary as statutes, maybe even more so because they're really, really detailed. The table of contents to identify other relevant sections, I think is critical. And again, updating, just being aware of when the source was updated and watching for any indications. eCFR, we talked about, great place because it's usually within a couple of days of the publication of the Federal Register. And just don't forget administrative materials when we start to talk about the exam. I can't tell you how much it breaks my heart when I read an exam and person's doing really great and they don't mention admin materials. It just kills me. And we'll go over how to help you remember that next class. We've already talked about, in terms of secondary sources, guides to help you pull it all together. So the one-stop research, the formerly known as loose leaps, whatever you want to call them online these days. The practice materials like AmJur, proof of facts, and causes of action. And all of the wonderful things that they provide in terms of forms and rules and checklists that we've talked about. As well as the secondary analysis. And you saw when you did your assignments and you looked at either RAA or CCH that it gave you that explanation, but it cited to and linked to a lot of the other materials. And as you see, we started with secondary materials and now we're coming back. And I think of research as a spiral. Unfortunately, it's, as I said in the first or second class, it's just not a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and I'm done. It'd be nice if it was, but then you wouldn't be taking a class in it because there would be no point. You're going to start and you're going to just go around and you're going to see a lot of irrelevant stuff and you're going to get references to cases that don't help you any and statutes, etc. But gradually you're going to narrow your way in and you will find more, increasingly more relevant material. But you will want to go back to secondary. One thing that I didn't mention explicitly on the handout, but you want to think about is those current awareness sources. We ran into a couple of them when we started with secondary materials, and then you will want to come back to current awareness sources as you start to finish up your research, just to make sure that you have updated and know any developments in the area. But also because you'll have a better understanding, so you'll have a better understanding of how these current updates might apply. And interestingly, the example I gave you of the student I was helping I guess yesterday, turned out that the best place to start was the New York Law Journal, because it was such a specific issue, and it's a specific issue, it was a landlord-tenant issue specific to New York, and there were a couple of articles in the New York Law Journal that referenced cases that got him started, and then he could get into the process that way. So your sort of diving in point is going to be different depending on the issue. And I've said it 100 times, so I'll say it 101, update, update, and update. Much easier now than the old day. I don't have to remind people to check the packet part because you don't really use that anymore. But again, just be aware of what you're looking at on the screen more like. Think about it when you're looking at websites, because websites, like I said, can be out there from 10 years ago. Question always get asked, when am I finished? Understand, I mean, if this has to be a comprehensive research project, it's not just you need a quick answer, you will never find everything, and don't expect to find everything, because that would be a waste of your time. But you'll start to get a sense that you're finishing up first when you feel like you've answered your questions. All of those questions that came up, oh, should I be thinking about negligence? You've done the research to answer that. Is the breach of fiduciary duty a possibility? You've answered that. You figured out, all right, I have a sense of whether we are preempted, we aren't preempted, what we want to do if we are, what if we're not, then what we can do in that case. So you've had a sense you've answered the question. And not just, you've just found a halfway decent answer so you can get on with it. You found a good answer. You found an answer that if you were the client, you would be happy with. You start to see the same references over and over. I don't know if you've noticed, but we started to see the same cases. We started Rush Prudential and Aetna. There were a couple of the New York cases when we did New York research, Chio, I don't know how to pronounce it, but we started to see some of the materials over. We saw that Amdur proof of facts a whole lot of times. You may not have noticed it because you weren't familiar with that resource, but that popped up. So when you start to see perhaps some of the New York statutory reference, and certainly, of course, our Section 1144 and Section 1132, which actually turns out also to be relevant. We didn't look at it much, but you start to see, again, a lot of what you found to be relevant getting referenced in the different places that you've gone. Any questions? So I wrote myself a few notes to remind you of some of the tips that we've gone over in terms of online, and I've kind of talked about most of these. So find out your contract, Lexis Westlaw contract, that is. Get comfortable with a couple of free legal research portals. And by that I mean we looked at the Legal Information Institute, looked at FindLaw, the New York courts. Turns out the New York courts, if you know how to use it, would I think Helen had pointed out, it was great for a place to go for the rules. Google Scholar, of course, for cases. If you need to be worried about cost, and again, depending on your contract, remember there's a lot of free stuff out there. And we looked at a lot of that, of course, Google Scholar and FedSys for federal materials, the New York legislative website, assembly site, again, the New York court site for New York. Remember about other, what I like to call all-you-can-eat databases. So you don't have to worry about paying for each document as it comes up. So you looked for the assignment at RIA and CCH. We looked a little bit at the native BNA. Actually, Bloomberg Law is an all-you-can-eat. Once you pay the subscription price, you're done. You can search as much as you want, and it doesn't cost any more. So be aware, wherever you wind up working, be aware of what they've got. Some of the tips I got from these law firm librarians, that in ways they had noticed that tripped up some of the new attorneys. And again, this is not something I've encountered, but I have to take their word. And these are librarians from mostly big firms. One was from a smaller specialized IP firm. So just to give you context of where this advice is coming from. Be curious about what you don't know. which I can appreciate can actually be difficult when you're pressed for time and you've got a ton to do, and then this new thing comes. It's like, oh, I really don't want to take the 10 minutes to look at this because I don't got the 10 minutes. You got to be curious about what you don't know. You can trip yourself up. Be adaptable. Again, I don't work in their world, but I guess the other word that came up in this meeting a lot was scalable, the idea of taking a technique from one area and translating it to the other. So the idea of a treatise in one area, good treatise in one area, there may be a good treatise in another. Maybe I should find out. Or the table of contents that I've talked about in just about every context we've talked about. And getting to know a resource, even just spending 5 minutes just to get a little bit familiar with it so you understand how it's structured. And speaking of the librarians I had this meeting with, take advantage of wherever you're working, the resources that are there. The admin people, like librarians, like the technology people that are there, you'd be surprised what they know. And not just librarians, but we do. But the other folks as well. There are a lot of people who work for these organizations whose job it is to make the mission of the organization, representing clients if it's a law firm, as successful as possible. And I will still insist that people are smarter than Google. So yeah, I'm not saying don't use Google, of course, but ask the people who have expertise. Maybe they're people who have researched that issue before. Another issue that came up with these librarians, be aware of your organization's knowledge management. Now that's a very frequently used term these days, and it can mean a lot of different things. But most organizations have some way of keeping track of their work product. So it's very possible that some attorney did a research on a very similar issue in the past. In a profit-making or even a non-profit-making organization these days, you can't afford to reinvent that wheel. Learn about whatever that organization's knowledge management system is. It might be a file cabinet with paper files in it. It sometimes are very, very, very sophisticated online systems. As I mentioned, Westlaw has one that unfortunately I couldn't show you because they won't give us access, but so it can run the gamut. Be aware of how your organization works. When you get a research assignment from whomever your supervisor is, a partner, an associate, a supervisor, ask them if they know any good resources. Find out what your partner's, if that's the partner, if it's the tax partner or the bankruptcy partner, find out what his or her favorite treatise is. It's a good way to get a start. Then you'll know what they rely on, and you don't have to worry about even finding a good treatise. Any questions? Okie dokie. So I'm going to dive now into our other topic for the day. This, again, was a little potpourri, as I mentioned last time. And useful web resources. And useful web resources that we haven't already looked at, because we've looked at a whole bunch. And the first one I want to look at is actually a legal database. Have any of you heard of Ravel-Law? It's the new thing on the block, competing with Lexis and Westlaw, at least for case law research. And rather than try to explain it to you, because I don't know that I could do it justice, let's, as I said, when I play with a new database, I like to do a familiar search so I can compare and contrast a little. So let's do what has turned into my favorite search anyway, probably not yours, our liability HMO. Now, let's see if it's going to do it for me. I had actually signed in. I have a 7-day trial. Oh, good. Here we go. So I have a 7-day trial to play with Ravel-Law. I'm not even sure I need it here. So you can see we get a list of cases on the right, and we get these bubbles on the left. And looking at the bottom, it looks like there's a sorting system, and we're using the Ravel sorting system. So it's sort by citational gravity, most important in the middle. So I'm guessing this big dot is the most important. We can sort by court or relevance or cluster, citation networks, whatever that is. Does this remind you of anything we saw very recently?
I forgot what it's called.
The FAST case. Actually, Adam, I think you discovered this a similar looking feature. Whether it's a similar functioning feature, I couldn't tell you because I hadn't played with that much, and I haven't really investigated this much. What I will tell you, last time when we investigated Fastcase, I suggested to you how I like to learn, and it's not the only way and it's not the best way, just what works for me is I like to play around. That works when I see something that's familiar and I can hang it on what I have learned before so I can add it to my understanding. This totally flummoxed me. I look at this, I'm not a visual person, I'm a word person. So when that happens, then I will go to the how-to. So here in Ravellaw, actually those are the contracts, just so you can see briefly what it would cost if you wanted to try Ravellaw. Not quite as easy on the wallet as Fastcase was, but not quite the same 5-digit that Lexis and Westlaw might cost you. And here is so if I wanted to sit down and really learn, and someday I will do this because I do really want to sit down and learn what Ravellaw might be able to do for me as a case researcher, I'm going to look at these videos and I'm going to look at these how-tos, because just playing around with it isn't informing me. And again, that's just for me, that make perfect sense to those of you who are far more visually oriented. But that seems to be a new, sort of the on the cusp new development in legal research, and especially case law research, is this visually oriented grouping things in these bubbles and what did they call it here? See, I understand it's citational gravity and sort of the interrelationships between cases. So something might be interesting to those of you that, again, are more visually oriented. So I ran across this actually a couple of days ago, and we're always talking about Google, and it turns out that I can wish you a happy Mobilegeddon Day, April 21st. What is Mobilegeddon Day? Turns out Google is changing a little bit of how it does its super secret search algorithm sauce to become more mobile friendly. And you can find out about that at this website called Search Engine Land. You've probably run into the term SEO, search engine optimization. Does that sound familiar to at least some of you? There is an entire industry out there of very, very talented tech people who figure out how to make their clients, businesses, websites show up higher in Google results or other search engines, which we'll talk about in a bit. But since Google is the standard these days, I mean, it's a verb for heaven's sakes now, there are businesses, lots of businesses out there that help their clients figure out how to make their business results show up in a Google search. Because think about it, how many of you search down, I mean, when you do a Google search, you get how many thousands, 10, 50, 100,000 results? How many of you go past the first page? Okay, a couple. How many go past the second page? So we have a couple of diligent people, okay, but we have at least a majority here, and I'm afraid I have to confess up on one of them. That doesn't really go much past the second page, because I've had enough by that. It's like, I got to find a better search if I have to go past the second page. And so there are a lot of people like those of us who don't have that level of patience. So you've got these industries to help optimize the search. And this Search Engine Land is a website that tracks this business. So just be aware that what's going on when you Google is not just these terms. It's a lot of business and people. There's a term out there, Google bombing. Have you heard of Google bombing? It's a way of structuring your web page to make it come up further. And I don't know how to do that, but the people who came up with that term probably do. Google is the standard, and it's a verb, like I said, for heaven's sakes. There are other search engines out there. Is it worth your time to try them? Oh, here's more about Mobilegeddon. I just have to love that name. Probably once in a great while, like anything, it's a good tool to have in the toolbox. You use what works, Google, and then if Google isn't doing so well, maybe you might want to try Bing or Yahoo, which you all probably have heard of. But there are actually a whole host of specialized search engines out there. And here on good old Wikipedia, yes, Wikipedia, there's a list of categories of search engines. Now these are categories. These aren't just the search engines. There's search engines for food recipes and fashion and computers, and I don't need to read this to you. Lots of search engines out there. So just be aware that it exists, and if Google isn't doing it for you, perhaps you want to check out a different search engine. So, for instance, and I'll show you just one because it goes along the line of our theme of pulling together material when looking at a table of contents for other sections, in most of the case in our exam, for other sections in the same topic. Yippee, horrible name. It actually had a worse name before Yippee. It was called Clusty. So they decided we need to change the name, and then they came up with Yippee. But anyway, so Yippee. Yippee clusters results along topical areas. So, for instance, I did the search China. China has two very different definitions. There's the country, and then there are the dishes and other things made out of the substance called China, for lack of a better term. And if you search Google for the word China, what you're going to get is lots of information about the country China. So I would either have to go through deep into the various pages, which, as I mentioned, I tend not to do, and there are more than 10 of them, or I would have to change my search, which might work. Another way, here in Yippee, Yippee gives me different aspects of the results of my search, and if I look, and basically most of those aspects start out here just listed. So if I say, okay, if I'm really interested in the dishes, they're probably manufacturers of those dishes. And so I expand that topic. And yes, there's a whole lot about the country, but here's bone china. Oh yeah, I wouldn't have thought to search bone china. I always just think of it as China. Maybe that's my ignorance, but anyway, so I could then narrow using Yippee. Again, just another resource for that toolbox. Another interesting search engine out there for those of the more computational mathematical minds is something called, and this is a fairly new up-and-coming concept in search engine technology, and it's Wolfram Alpha, and you can see it's a computational knowledge engine. So I'm going to type in a concept near and dear to all of our hearts, lawyers. And it gives us some basic information, employment history. You type lawyers in Google. I haven't done it yet, but my guess is you'll get some ads for lawyers and a whole bunch of other directories for lawyers maybe. But this is just facts and computations about lawyers. So again, just good to know, I think, that these exist. On your handout, I list a couple. We've talked a lot about somewhat about website evaluation back when we talked about that in the beginning of the semester, and I just re-emphasize now the importance of it. If you want something a little more structured than just sort of being aware of where the website's coming from and up to date, take a look at any of these sites. I promised you in the first class that we would go over some, since Google is the standard, we would go over some advanced Google techniques. And I showed you one of them, actually my favorite one, the site search, but there are others. And so I am now going to keep that promise. Before I keep that promise, how many of you have Google accounts, whether Gmail or you use other Google features? So a good number of you. How many of you are aware of what the Google privacy policy is and the fact that depending on what you click, they'll keep track of your searches? Okay, good. Here I am showing you the Google, if you do have a Google account, take a look at the privacy policy and just make an informed choice. So wherever your comfort level is in privacy, like I have a Gmail account, as you'll see, I have a lot of stuff. I have my calendar on Google, a lot of stuff on Google. For some reason, it totally flips me out that they keep track of my searches, so I've turned that one off. Now, you may think it's nuts to have my calendar, you wouldn't want your calendar out there on Google for anybody, but not everybody can see. But again, just think about it, make your choice. So those are the Google privacy, and now I will show. So to get to advanced Google, they keep on moving this around. I don't know why, because they're kind of cool features. But to get to advanced Google, the best, easiest way I have found is just to do a search. Do any search. Type the word China, type the word lawyers. I typed life, the universe, and everything just because it amused me to do that. And what you're looking for is on the right-hand side, this gear icon, once you've done a search. It's not there on the original Google page. Again, I don't know why they hide it, but for now, that's how it happens. Clicking on that, you will see advanced search. And what you'll see is a nice template with some of the advanced search options. Actually, only a handful. There are a lot more, which we'll look at in a moment. And what you will see, we can do an exact phrase. You see my original search up here. You could choose any of these. This kind of looks a little bit like Westlaw, doesn't it? Or actually, Westlaw looks like Google. But anyway, you can choose a language if you want to search in a different language. Need to read these for you. I will highlight the ones that are useful. We've already done the site or domain. So if I were to type in without a typo, and I very much doubt we'll find anything at Hofstra with that. So how about just say, that's going to be a weird search, but that's okay. So I will search the site Hofstra, and what you will see, and we've done this before, is we search Hofstra for that particular word, but you'll notice, and the reason I wanted to do this, since we've done this before, is you'll see that all Google did in that advanced search template is put in the search term site : as we've talked about before. So you can either go to the template, or if you remember it, you can do it directly. So that's the only reason I wanted to show you that, is you could do it either way. Another aspect, advanced search aspect we haven't spoken about, is the file type. Any of these might be very useful. The two I think on this that are the most useful is site and the file type. And by file type, you can search and say to Google, I want to find a PDF. And an example of where that might be useful is we were looking at Google's annual report. And I happen to have discovered, as I was Googling, that annual reports appear in PDF. So that way I can just tell Google, forget all the other irrelevant stuff. I just want those PDFs. And what you get, as you can see, are all PDFs with my particular search terms. And actually, I left the site search in there, so that's why we're only getting Hofstra. My mistake. So you'd want to make sure to delete what you don't want to search. Another file, you can take a look at all these file types. Another useful one that I've used, if I want to find, I want to educate myself on something, I might go for a PowerPoint. So I can search for Microsoft PowerPoints, or I can search for Docs. And again, let's just do the advanced search so you see the results. So now I'm getting all PowerPoints. And you can see what Google does up here. If you remember the search phrase file type : and PDF is typically what I do. I'll just type it in direct. Or you can go to the gear icon again once you've done your search and do it from the template. So let me actually go back to my gear icon. So that's one way to get to advanced Google. Again, this gear icon history. Actually, it's wanting me to log in, which I'm not going to do because actually I don't track the history. But that's where you'd find out if you allowed Google to keep track of your history. That's one way to get to it. Another place to find advanced Google, and I don't know why they spread it out like this, is actually search help. And yes, the whole point of Google is it's nice and simple and you don't really need help because you just type in the very simple box, but there are other, and you can investigate the search help for some of these other aspects that look interesting. What I find interesting and the most useful is under the filter and refine your results. And yes, I know how to search Google if I were interested in images, but I'm going to go here to punctuation symbols and operators, which may not sound very interesting, but what this will tell us about are different ways we can refine and do an advanced search, kind of like what we do on Lexis and Westlaw within, so we can search using these different symbols. So here's a way to find prices. And they're just a whole range, and those search operators. So we looked at some of these, remember, the site search, of course. Here's the OR operator. If you just throw in words in Google, it assumes and. If you don't want that, you can change it to OR. The cache search is very much like our friend the Wayback Machine. Everybody remember the Wayback Machine? If you want to see what a page looked like in a prior time, very good if you're not able to get to the page because the link is broken today because the site's not working or they took it down, you can get to the page. You can also use cache : and get to it on Google that way. And do I have the other thing? Actually, let's go other advanced Google. This isn't so much searching as tools, so I'm now going to move on to some useful Google products, features that kind of straddle the line between search and products. And one of them, here's the Google products page, and you can get to this any number of ways, but you can also just Google Google products, which is how I typically do. And one of those, which this is what I hate about Google, is used to be on that Google products page, but is no longer. I'm going to see if it's going to let me do it from here. No, it's searching help. There we go. I love their doodles, though. I may have mentioned this before. So Google Alerts. You can do a Google search. I'm still in the help. And you can set up a Google alert. Just like you can on Lexis and Westlaw, you can say, hey, Lexis, Westlaw, deliver this search to me every week, every month. You can tell Google to do the same. Getting there, so this basically, you need to have a Google account. So that's why I asked some of you if you have a Google account. So you can see, actually, I've got a bunch of alerts set up here because I saved them so that they repeat, and I get emails from Google telling me, hey, here are new results for your particular search. So if you're following an issue or just want to know when a new favorite group of yours is appearing somewhere across the country or in New York, Google Alert is actually not a bad way to go at it. And the Google Alerts used to be listed in their products page, but they took it out, which is my main complaint about Google, is they have cool stuff and then they stop when they get bored with it because they've got new stuff to do, like driverless cars. Then they say, we're not going to support that anymore, even though a bunch of us love it. And not just yours truly. But here are some of the other products. They still do support alerts. Here's some of the other products worth going through. I'm obviously not going to go over all or even most of these. Some of these you're familiar with, but I like to scroll through here now and again and just see what's there that I haven't noticed before. So, for instance, I've noticed, and I haven't investigated it yet, Google Cloud Print. So I'm wondering if there's a way I can print from my iPad that I didn't know about before, because right now I don't have an iPad-friendly printer. So it's just this weird stuff that you run across. Oh, that could be useful. I'll have to investigate that. And not just under. So interesting to go through. What is worth looking at a little more closely, and I talked to a couple of you as you came in, if you were Google Drive or Docs user. How many of you use Google Drive? How many use another cloud sharing? Dropbox? Box? there are a bunch others. Dropbox was the first one I heard of a number of years ago. And do you all know what cloud sharing is? Basically, this is a way, so I have my laptop here. You also, many of you have seen me sitting at the reference desk. If I want to work on a document and I don't want to have to email it to myself, or I don't want to access it, and I want to access it at home as well as at work, I put it in cloud sharing. Google Drive is a Dropbox equivalent for those of you who use Dropbox. I actually use both depending on my mood and different functionality. So here you see my Google Drive, and I've got a bunch of different documents. What Google Drive, so I have Word documents, as you can see. I also have Google Documents. There's also spreadsheets. You can actually make forms on Google Drive, so there's lots of funky stuff you can do. In terms of one reason I use Google Drive and not Dropbox is that Google Drive allows me to share documents. So I work with all of the reference librarians. So when we're working on a group project, we're working on a handout for a class we're doing, one of us will put a document up on Google Drive and share it with the rest of us. So here is today's handout. Actually, that's not the one I want. Bear with me if you don't mind while I pull up the demo copy of today's handout. And if I want to share it with anybody, so a couple of you kindly gave me your Google accounts, so I will type that in now, hopefully without any typos. Pardon me? No I. See, I told you I'd have a typo. At gmail.com. I think I can do commas. Let's see if I can do, yep, I just do a comma, and then comma. So you can see I can do a whole bunch at once if I so choose, or just one, obviously. One at gmail.com. And there's a reason I'm doing this, as you'll see. So I'm giving you edit rights. So I've now shared it with 3 of you. If you're logged into your Google account, any of you, Royce, Adam, Justin, logged in, you should see, so Royce just, I don't know if you saw on the screen, do what you just did, Royce. Did you open the document? So Royce, you somehow came up. So Royce is looking at the document. So as you're looking at the document, scroll down and type something. Oh. So we are doing real-time sharing now. Obviously not a big deal because we're in the same room. But if Royce were in California and I were here, we could still do this. So you can do some serious collaborative drafting with this. And it does have a little bit of the coolness factor, I think. Maybe I'm just easily entertained. But even if you're not doing the real time with the cool, seeing everybody do the editing, it does allow you to do some nice collaborative asynchronous editing. In other words, I can sit down and do it when I feel like it at 2 a.m. in my pajamas, and then you all can do it at totally normal times, and we can see what each other has done. We can add comments. So I can insert a comment, and I can say, Adam, take a look at item 2. And you now see that comment is from me. And so, Adam, when you were to log into this, if you were at 2 a.m.
I don't see the comment.
No, it should be in there. Oh, you're quite right. So if you're looking at 2 a.m. in your pajamas, you would see this and you could take a look at item 2 and either reply to my comment or change the document. So very useful for collaborative editing. And as I mentioned, this was uploaded, this started as a Word document. I uploaded and converted it, and it's very easy to do, to a Google document so we could do all this fun stuff. Or, as you saw in my Drive, you could just keep it as a Word document if you wanted to do it that way. And the other thing I can do, I can make this handout available to you in perpetuity, or at least as long as I keep it in my Drive. All I need to do is I can either share it with you, or I can just send you the link to this particular document. I would have to make this public, which it currently is not. But if I wanted to make it public, again, it would be easy enough to do. Actually, I think there's the link. So, or I can just send you the link if I didn't want the rest of the world to find it. And as I mentioned, Google has a bunch of different, so there's the calendar. And I have shared a calendar with the chat group, or really they've shared their calendar with me. So it's a way of working with a group and scheduling. It's also, I know a lot of people use it for personal purposes with their families, significant others, whatever, to keep track of what's going on in life and seeing if there's any conflict, if you want to go make a dinner date or something. And in Drive, I mentioned, let's see if, so here's a form that I created using Google Forms for feedback for a workshop that I did. And, very basic checkboxes and whatnot. They're Google spreadsheets, Google Sheets they call it. There's actually Google Slides, Google version of PowerPoint. And all with sharing capabilities. I don't know if they all have that real-time editing capability. I haven't played with Sheets or PowerPoint for that, but I do know they have sharing capabilities. The only other aspect I'll show you, and then we'll call it a day, and you probably all know about, there are lots of mobile apps for your phones, your tablets, what have you. This is a guide. Again, research guides are very useful, done by a law librarian in a school, surprise, surprise. And this particular librarian did a research guide on mobile apps for law. And here's a list, and this isn't the only one, there are a bunch of them. I just actually learned of one, mobile apps for access to justice apps. So people who are representing those who have less opportunity to hire their own lawyer. There are a whole bunch of apps for that too. As the saying goes, there's an app for that. Well, here you can see we've got Fastcase has an app. I mentioned that actually last time. Hein Online, Lexis, Westlaw, Bloomberg, and some other interesting apps that may be interesting, worthwhile having on your phone/tablet. Oh, look at this. See, this is new since I've investigated apps for law school and bar exam study. So those of you 3Ls may already know about whatever app is. But those are some of the useful tools I found on the web. There are hundreds, if not thousands others, obviously, that don't have time to go over, but hopefully some of them. I think the cloud sharing probably is the most useful I've discovered. I use it for all sorts of activities, both work and personal. And at this point, I can't imagine how I ever existed without Dropbox and Google Drive. Any questions? Okay. Next time, as promised since the beginning of the semester, we will go over in depth the exam. And if you emailed me your assignment sort of pretty much after a 3:45, I will get back to you with the acknowledgement when I get back to my office.